Welcome to the Gary Null Show, a program designed to enhance mental, physical, and spiritual well-being through science and the wisdom of the ages. Let us take you on a journey of empowerment. Sit back, relax, and get ready to change your life for good.
Hi everyone, I'm Gary Null. Nice to have you back. We talk about health and nutrition. Well, what's one of the #1 health issues in the world today? AIDS. Now, most of you do not have AIDS, will never have AIDS, but this is informative because it's going to dispel many of the myths about AIDS. In fact, almost everything you've ever heard about AIDS, you'll see, could be challenged as a myth. Join me now as we take you around the world, giving you the other side of the story on AIDS.
If you take a culture which has never had a retrovirus added to it, and you put it on the bench and wait for a week or two, it may actually start to produce retroviral particles and the other phenomena which go with retroviruses spontaneously. You can increase the rate of appearance of this and the yield many times, millions of times, by irradiating the cultures or by adding the same stimulating agents that are used in AIDS cultures, or by culturing with other cells, co-cultures, as are used to isolate HIV, or just fluids from other cell cultures. And these viruses are called endogenous retroviruses because they come from within and not from without. And the reason that they appear is because we inherit DNA which can actually be made to go to work to actually produce these phenomena, these particles. This is actually called endogenous retroviral expression. I mean, we're looking at 1% of the human genome as being made up of endogenous retroviral information, instructions sitting there waiting to make retroviruses when switched on by some stimulus. And so we don't know if HIV is a genuine retrovirus, that it may in fact be endogenous, and it may be the result of getting AIDS and not the cause. I mean, this will not be the first time that this has happened. Retrovirologists themselves in the past have in fact postulated that diseases may cause retroviruses and not the other way around.
Retroviral-like particles are practically ubiquitous everywhere in cell cultures. You simply can't point to one in an impure cell culture and call it HIV. Even Robert Gallo admits that particles that look like retroviruses but aren't retroviruses because they can't reproduce are found not only in impure cell cultures, but even in the band associated, the density band associated with purified HIV particles. You need more evidence than that before you can point to one of these particles in a cell culture and say it's HIV. Unfortunately, these particles are reproduced by the thousands in newspapers, in magazines. They're the basis of artist conceptions that you see in Newsweek and Time. None of them have been proven by standard means that we have at our disposal to be not simply retroviruses, but a unique retrovirus, HIV.
Little wonder the public is confused about the subject of HIV testing. For on the one hand, we're told to take the AIDS test. The AIDS test is to determine, will we get AIDS? Do we have the HIV virus? Which will then mean we will eventually have AIDS and die. But all one has to do is open the test kit, look at the literature inside the test kit, and clearly it says that this should not be used as interpreting a person has AIDS or HIV virus. Well, therefore, if the test is not testing for the presence of a disease state or even an antibody that could precipitate a disease state, then what is its value?
There are two tests in common use. One's called the ELISA, the other's called the Western blot. The only difference between them is that in the ELISA test, all the so-called HIV proteins, about 10 of them, are all mixed up together in a solution. And in the Western blot, prior to reacting, the proteins have been separated out into a nitrocellulose strip. Now, the test that really matters in all this is the Western blot. So we really don't need to discuss the ELISA test. It's used as a screening test, and it is admitted by experts that it is not sufficiently specific to diagnose HIV infection, whereas the Western blot, if positive, is considered synonymous with HIV infection.
The standard screening test is an ELISA. Occasionally you get a false positive. Under those circumstances, a Western blot can absolutely confirm. Western blots are also important when you have people, for example, who have been vaccinated in vaccine trials and making antibody against one protein. The only way you're going to tell if they're infected serologically is by looking at a Western blot showing they make antibodies to the other protein. So it has a lot of value. It's fundamentally a confirmatory diagnostic test.
This is representing a Western blot strip. A Western blot strip is a thin strip, like the strip that your doctor uses to test your urine. And in it, on the strip, placed several proteins, 10 of them in the case of HIV, separated by their molecular weights. And in the test, plasma is added to the strip, and if there are antibodies in the plasma which react with any of these proteins, then the strip turns dark. So a Western blot test appears as a series of dark horizontal bands. Now, one of the problems of the Western blot test is that it is not reproducible. This is a test of a positive serum performed in 19 reference laboratories, all on the same specimen of blood. And as you can see, just by looking at this, no two are alike.
The proteins used on that Western blot strip that scientists claim are HIV proteins may not necessarily be HIV proteins. There's no proof that they are, and there's plenty of evidence that these are normal human cellular proteins that have been misidentified. This conclusion seems hardly debatable in the case of P32, one of these purportedly HIV proteins that's been shown to be identical in amino acid sequence to a normal human protein associated with human T cell function. Another one of these proteins, P41, has been considered by Montagnier's group, Montagnier, the original discoverer of HIV, to be a contaminant, the ubiquitous cellular protein actin. Yet it's right there on your Western blot test, masquerading as an HIV protein.
It's nearly impossible to determine the rate of false positives because there is no gold standard to independently verify test results. People with non-AIDS diseases have antibodies that can register a positive result on the HIV antibody test. Indeed, people with multiple sclerosis, T-cell lymphoma, generalized warts, and other diseases have the P24 antigen.
And we also know that AIDS patients, despite being immune deficient, have lots of antibodies, more antibodies than healthy people. And many of these antibodies react with cellular proteins. That's just data that's widely available and not disputed. And we also know, or we can bet, that AIDS patients also contain other infectious agents, such as other viruses, because we all know that if someone gets needle stuck from an AIDS patient, it's not just HIV that people are worrying about catching. You're more likely to develop antibodies to hepatitis B virus than HIV, 30 times more likely. So we can bet that the proteins from other viruses will be present in the cultures as well.
Based upon the HIV equals AIDS hypothesis, they then gave us the test. Now,
they didn't give it to us, they sold it to us.
Yeah, who sold it to us? Who gets money off
Bob
the
Gallo himself was getting quite a bit off of it. He had to give a lot back to Montagnier when it was finally proven that he stole the virus from Montagnier in the first place. But Montagnier and the Pasteur Institute are getting $1, I think, or so every time that somebody gets an HIV test.
When he came up with his first test, he tested 30% of the American blood donators, so let's say the general population, he tested them positive. And the industry said, no, go home, Gallo. We won't buy your test because this is going to destroy our business. And the only thing what he did, he lowered the sensitivity of the antibody test. and that you can read in your library. You shouldn't believe me a single word. That's about science. Check it. I'm not speaking about thesis, opinions, or things, foggy things. No, everything is there, and we reach the bottom line. There's no way out. They designed a test to select gay people. And when, of course, he's stimulating the cell with all kind of mitogens, carcinogens, and he, of course, added hydrocortisone, which he hasn't published. But this matters. They added hydrocortisone like people under persistent stress, hypercortisolism, that the same proteins are produced.
There's also data from a number of hospitals in the US, which was published in 1988, where they tested nearly 90,000 blood samples anonymously on hospital patients. And these patients were selected to have no risks for HIV infection or AIDS. In some of the hospitals, they found 25% of men were HIV positive on the Western blot, the most specific test, and they found that 8% of women were HIV positive on the Western blot. I mean, this should lead one to question again, how do that many people who have no risk for HIV or AIDS get to have that many HIV antibodies?
Being HIV positive puts you in a precarious position where your health can be judged in a way that no one else's health is judged. And when you're a woman and you're pregnant or you have a family, it presents a danger. When I was pregnant and I did not want to go on the drug therapies, had I had any of the problems that my HIV negative pregnant friends had, such as chronic yeast infections or even toxoplasmosis, I would have been considered having AIDS, and I would have been considered more irresponsible than I already was for having ever gotten pregnant in the first place, and I would have decidedly risked having my son taken away from me at birth.
There's so many factors that can even cause a false positive, from flu vaccine to herpes or venereal disease, alcoholism, and you can be told that you're positive and not even be positive, whatever that means. I have friends who've been through this. A friend who went through years of being told he was positive till he went to another doctor who said, we're not finding anything, we're using all our tests. And now he's confused and goes back and forth. There's no oversight in any of this, but they're terrorizing and ripping people's lives apart with unsupportable data.
Nobody can find free infectious HIV virus in a human being. That is why they have to resort to looking for antibodies to HIV in a person. That is one of the biggest flaws in the HIV hypothesis, that antibodies, which are a sign of immunity, you should be happy that you have antibodies. It means that you are now immune. And yet with AIDS, we have antibodies as a predictor or an indicator of AIDS and future death. It doesn't make any sense to me.
In different countries or institutions or laboratories around the world, what is criteria used to define a positive Western blot test vary considerably. That is, the number of bands required vary considerably. And here we have on the chart several different institutions, France, United Kingdom, Germany, some American institutions, the US Red Cross, the FDA, and you can see by looking at this chart that just about every lane is different. Now this has some interesting implications. For instance, in Australia, which is the second lane, you need 4 bands to be deemed HIV infected. In fact, Australia is probably the hardest country, in fact, in which to be deemed HIV positive. But in other parts of the world, you don't need that many bands. In Africa, you need 2. In some parts of America, you need 2. In some parts of America, you need 3. And in the MAC study, the multi-centre AIDS cohort study, up till 1990, just 1 band was considered sufficient to diagnose a gay man HIV infected.
When you have indeterminate bands and you don't have the full array of them, then there's obviously the iffy situation where you need to repeat it. But I don't think that there's anything wrong with different countries having different criteria, because the different criteria are only really for that small group of patients that come in the indeterminate level. When a Western blot is really positive, it hits you like a truck. It's only for that little indeterminate group that you have to be concerned.
This means, in theory at least, that if you were tested in New York today, then flew to Australia, and you had 3 bands in New York, you would not be positive in Australia, but you would be positive in New York City. Now, I mean, a virus cannot behave in this manner, and this is what has led us to hypothesise that there is no proof that any person with a positive antibody test, no matter how defined, is in fact infected with this so-called lethal retrovirus.
Since '92, there is no Western blot in Great Britain because they saw it's a waste of money, you know. It's the same principle.
Well, the bulk of the world uses it. If some technology comes across better, I'd be the first to say, do it. I mean, obviously. The Western blot's a valuable test as defining the proteins that you have antibodies to. Everybody uses it experimentally, and most people use it clinically around the world. Not, maybe Britain doesn't use it, maybe there are 2 countries that found a better way, God bless them.
If they didn't allow them to charge so much for it, I think there'll be a lot less use of it. You know, it's just like in political scandals. Follow the money trail. Figure out who's getting paid for this. Who's getting the money for those Western blots. There's your person who's going to always come down on the side of, yeah, you got a confirmatory Western blots, they call it. You know, do a confirmatory Western blot. Well, let's see. And those things are so hokey, it's just ridiculous. I didn't know they don't even do them in England anymore.
No,
but
not since 1992.
It's totally, and ask a doctor how it works. The doctor who prescribes, who says, got to have a Western blot to confirm this ELISA positive thing. How does that work, doctor? Sir, what are they now measuring about me that's different from what they measured with the ELISA test? He wouldn't know. He's not got any idea. I'll bet you there's scarcely 50 physicians in this country that know what a Western blot really is. They know when to order it, and they know they get a kickback on it probably. They make some money from having to take the blood or whatever. And they make money by prescribing AZT. They get money every time they turn around. They get money.
If there's one way we've been told AIDS is transmitted, it's sexually. What is the evidence that AIDS is sexually transmitted? Much evidence exists to the contrary.
The statistics have been confirmed over and over again, most recently just last year from the University of California at San Francisco, that it takes, on average, 1,000 sexual contacts with an HIV person or persons in order to become HIV positive yourself. That means 1,000. Put that in comparison with typical sexually transmitted diseases. It takes, on average, 2 to 3 sexual contacts to get gonorrhea or syphilis, for example. Now, the CDC has estimated a constant 1 million Americans infected with HIV over the past 10 years, constant number. That right there should be a giveaway. It's not spreading in society.
That's not an epidemic. The number of cases reported went up epidemically, you know, exponentially, because the number of tests that was done went up exponentially. The first time I ever saw one of these CDC graphs, it showed the thing going off the page. You know, I went up after that and I said, how did you disentangle I mean, did you divide the number that you've got here by the number of tests that were done? I mean, can we believe that this line that you've drawn here about number of positive tests reported, is that really indicative of the spread of this virus? Is the virus getting, is there being more of it, or are there more tests? If you divide by the number of tests you do, you don't get any kind of a curve going up. It's just, how many doctors knew about HIV in 1983? 2. How many knew about it in 1985? Say 500. How many knew about it in 1986? 40,000. So that's where the curve came from. How many tests were done? Same thing. How many tests? They could have just said, how much money did we make off of HIV this year? And they could have plotted that, and it would have looked the same. You know, and they could have said it's an epidemic because we're making more and more money off of it every year.
The heterosexual epidemic certainly hasn't seemed to have materialised in Australia. For example, in 1991, 10 years after AIDS commenced, researchers were able to write that no Australian prostitutes had been infected through sexual intercourse. None.
In the MAX study, as far back as 1987, they have shown that in this prospective study, the only sexual act directly related to the development of the phenomenon which is called HIV and of AIDS was passive anal intercourse. By 1997, Nancy Pedian has proven that AIDS cannot be heterosexually transmitted. They had couples there who either one or the other was positive, and they were followed up for more than 6 years. And although nearly 25% of the couples were not using condoms, still no one of the negative couples ever seroconverted. So there is ample evidence that HIV cannot be sexually transmitted.
The thing about safe sex, and using condoms, I think it is important to use condoms, but not for HIV. I think it's important for other like sexually transmitted diseases and just general hygiene.
If it's just caused by needles, or it's just caused by homosexual activities, you're not going to really get a long, sustained public outcry against it, and nobody's going to want to spend $6 billion a year. They're going to say, well, we really didn't like those people anyhow. Great. I can't think of a better solution to the homosexual problem than a disease that'll kill them all. I mean, there would be congressmen that would talk about that quietly, not on television. So the CDC had to say, we can't say that. We got to say it's got to be heterosexually transmitted. There's no proof that it's transmitted at all at that point. So why not just say, well, it's heterosexually transmitted too? It must be in semen. And when they looked for it in semen, they didn't find it. They had no evidence that it was sexually transmitted or any other way transmitted. They just said it because that made it a plague. And the CDC needed one. The CDC hadn't had a good plague since polio. Their funding was probably going to be cut back if they didn't come up with one. The guy that was the head of the CDC, in fact, wrote memos that have been obtained, where he describes this as hot stuff. Those guys have got an agenda, which is not what we would like them to have, being that we pay for them to take care of our health in some way.
The whole idea of sexual freedom and the puritanical America that has reacted to that since the 60s sexual revolution, it fits right into what they want to do. It says that if you have sex, you can die, literally. And that just so fits that whole fundamentalist Christian right perspective. So somebody's pleased by this. And so the right-wing conservative side of America, the anti-sexual freedom side, is very pleased with this whole AIDS epidemic.
Gay sex is not a disease. It's been happening throughout history. Whatever's happening now is something different, but we've been taught to be afraid to be gay and for people to be afraid of gay sex.
There were people who felt that a single virus theory would be useful in helping to raise public awareness about the disease. It would help them get the research they thought was necessary and public funding for its treatment by scaring people into believing that while the disease was affecting gay men now, it was eventually going to spread throughout the heterosexual population. This political definition of the disease has proven to be inaccurate and inconsistent with its real medical nature.
The CDC catches wind of this phenomenon happening among gay men, and they believe that it's a virus that's to blame. Now, of course, there's no historical precedent for believing that a single virus could devastate a normal immune system, but the individual at the CDC investigating this situation on the task force regarding Kaposi sarcoma and opportunistic infections were all infectious disease specialists. They're used to blaming viruses for diseases, and that was their leading theory from the get-go. And in order to validate this theory that a virus was to blame for these immunodeficiencies among gay men, they actively sought out other cases of unexplained immunodeficiency throughout the U.S. in other populations. And lo and behold, they found unexplained diseases of immunodeficiency among IV drug users. I'm sorry, you've got a similar situation, exposure to innumerable microbes, typically through unhygienic needle use, and heavy-duty drug use among this population of IV drug users. Is it so surprising that they would have immune problems? I mean, junkies are famous for dying of opportunistic infections, including pneumonias. Soon enough, they identified immunodeficiency diseases among hemophiliacs. And they published this finding, much to the astoundment of scientists, doctors, and the general public. It seemed that the virus causing the immunodeficiencies among gay men, that had spread through needle use to IV drug users, had spread through factor VIII to hemophiliacs. factor VIII was a new blood product used among hemophiliacs in order to restore their blood clotting capability. The difficulty with factor VIII was that due to purification technology in the 1970s, factor VIII was a terribly impure blood product. In fact, it was 99 to 99.9% impure, meaning that it was loaded with other viruses and foreign proteins from as many as 10,000 donors per dose of factor VIII, which meant that over the course of a year, a regular user of factor VIII might be exposed to the foreign viruses and proteins of upwards of 2 million different blood donors. Now that in itself can be terribly immune suppressive. But the CDC preferred to believe that the immune problems among hemophiliacs was also caused by a virus. And the CDC went on to identify immune problems among babies, all of whom in the early years were born to drug-addicted mothers, and identify immune problems among transfusion victims. You've got transfusion victims who are getting blood transfusions which have been shown to be immunosuppressive. As a matter of fact, in the 1970s, medical scientists had begun infusing organ receivers with donated blood before receiving their new organs, because that donated blood was shown to suppress their immune system and hence prevent organ rejection. So you've got several populations in which there are perfectly plausible alternative explanations for immune suppression and related diseases.
For more than 15 years, one of the indicators to determine do you have AIDS, how sick are you with AIDS, is your T-cell count. We've been led to believe that by measuring our T4 and 8 helper cells that it will indicate how far along we are in our progression. The lower the T-cell count, the more sick you are.
Now the CDC muddied the waters somewhat in 1993 when it added a new condition to the definition of AIDS, which was T-cell counts under 200. Now, since 1993, if you have an HIV antibody test that's positive and a T-cell count under 200, you can be considered an AIDS patient. Now, this is quite an innovation. As of last year, according to the CDC's own statistics, 65% of patients who've been diagnosed with AIDS in the calendar year of 1997 were diagnosed solely on the basis of having a positive HIV test and low T-cell counts. Not on the basis of a disease like pneumocystis pneumonia or Kaposi sarcoma. They were diagnosed with a deadly illness on the basis of 2 laboratory findings, an HIV positive test and a T-cell count under 200. The problem with a T-cell count under 200 is that it's never been shown to be a valid indicator of illness. In the only study of its kind of HIV negative healthy individuals that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1992, T-cell counts of these individuals were found to range from 237 to 1,817. So suddenly we're looking at a 200 T-cell count as something on the low end of normal. But if you're HIV positive and you have a T-cell count under 200, just once, then you're considered a victim of a deadly disease and considered an AIDS statistic. Suddenly a whole lot of people can qualify for an AIDS diagnosis on that basis and for a lot of government funding.
It's not possible to measure the strength of your immune system using the blood. It makes no sense because only 2% of those white blood cells or lymphocytes said to be responsible for immune functions are in the blood. All the others are in the tissues where they have to do their work. It's like looking outside onto the street and counting the police cars coming by every day, and you would count 10 usually, but suddenly only 3, and then you would say 7 of those policemen are caught up or were killed by the virus mafia in the Bronx. But that's completely mistaken. They are probably somewhere else to do their job, and that's how it works in our body.
Please come back next week, and we'll continue our journey on deconstructing the myth of AIDS. I'm Gary Null. Thank you very much for watching.